I'll talk about spirituality, but before I can talk about spirituality, I need to define spirituality. And I have an equation for that. My equation is spirituality equals religion minus dogma. An example of dogma would be any religion that says, this book here is the truth and you must believe it, that's dogma. Subtract that from that religion. And besides that kind of dogma, religion also has things like, they're either theistic or non-theistic religions, there are both kinds. They cultivate a number of positive values, and they use various spiritual practices to try to achieve those values. So another example of dogma would be anything that the religion says about their God. If they say God created the universe, God does this, God does that, subtract that out away from what the religion says. And hopefully what you're left with is the spirituality, which I'll be talking about here today. So I'll explain all of these and also why and how spiritual practices work. Now, my main hypothesis is that spirituality began around 40,000 to 100,000 years ago when human consciousness changed. Consider that the modern human really lives in two different worlds. We live in the sensory world presented by our senses, and then we live in a conceptual world that's indicated by symbols and words of language. So there's two different worlds that we live in. Whereas ancient humans and animals lived essentially in only one world, which is the sensory world. The world where they can sense what's going on in the world and things like that. For example, chimpanzees in the wild have about 30 call signs that they give to each other. So you could say that their language has about 30 words in it. And that's all they have. So they're mostly living in the sensory world. Now, the human conceptual world is much richer than the sensory world. For example, modern English has about 1 million words in the language right now. But a concept doesn't have to be a single word. A concept can be a phrase or it can be a whole paragraph. It doesn't have to be just one simple word. Another example is that there have been about 50 million scholarly articles published since the 1600s, when they started publishing scholarly articles. So if you consider each of those scholarly articles to have, say, 10 new concepts that get introduced, that means there are 500 million concepts introduced in the scientific literature. And that's growing rapidly each year. In addition, you could add all the concepts that exist in all the law books and all the concepts in technology. Software engineering, hardware engineering, all that kind of stuff, all creates lots and lots of concepts that they use in their work. So you'd have to add all those concepts into the total number of concepts. And finally, add all the concepts that are created in works of fiction. They create concepts there too. So I claim that overall, humanity must have created significantly more than 1 billion concepts so far in its lifetime. Now, no one human is aware of all those billion concepts. We only have our little subset that we work with. But the overlapping subsets add up to all the concepts that humans have created. Now, the great majority of those concepts do not describe objects in the physical sensory world. They are abstract concepts. They are not concrete concepts. So the question is, when did we cross over the threshold from mostly living in the world presented by our senses to mostly living in the world of concepts? And my hypothesis is that we crossed that threshold around the time of the development of behavioral modernity. Now, behavioral modernity developed around 40 to 100,000 years ago, and it includes all these traits here. So this is, by the way, this is a relatively rapid transition, which I'll demonstrate on the next slide, compared to the slow behavioral trait evolution before this time. So to get a sampling of behavioral traits, I went to the Smithsonian's fact sheet on milestones in human evolution. They had 39 traits listed there. 5 of them were anatomical traits, like changed knee joints and hip joints, things like that. 5 were related to migration to different continents, and 5 were about other species becoming extinct. So that left 24 behavioral traits, and here's the first 12 of those 24 behavioral traits. So I want to point out a few of them. At about 1.6 million years ago, we developed a hand axe. A hand axe is simply a rock that you hold in your hand that has like a pointed edge or a sharp edge that you can use to break things or cut things. But we had started making tools about 1 million years before that, but it took us 1 million years to come up with the hand axe. And the hand axe persisted for another 1.2 million years. So we weren't making great technological progress back then. Finally, around 500,000 years ago, our brain had expanded to approximately the modern human brain size. So we basically had the same brain 500,000 years ago that we have now. And at 200,000 years ago, we were anatomically modern. If a man from 200,000 years ago appeared here, he might look a little strange, but he would fit in. He would be the same as us. So the question is, why, if we had this modern brain at that time, why did it take so long for those behavioral modernity traits to arrive? And here's the last 12 of the 24 items on the list. And these are the 4 items that occurred during that range from 40 to 100,000 years ago. Notice, for example, burial of the dead. That could be an indication of a religion at that time. And the same thing for figurines. If they were praying to the god of fertility, that could be another indication of religion. So, I think there's indications that religion could have been forming around this time. And then finally, I'll end this whole list at about 5,000 years ago, because if we included all the significant milestones from then to now, this talk would go on forever. There have been a huge number of milestones in the last 5,000 years. So if you plot all these on a time plot, you get something like this. And you notice that it took a long time for the first few traits to happen, but in the last 40 to 100,000 years, they were coming fast and furious. To make a better understanding of this, let's put it on a log scale instead of a linear time scale. And on a log scale, it looks like this. Now, this is approximately a straight line, so it's really some kind of a logarithmic or exponential takeoff occurring around 40,000 to 100,000 years ago. Now, clearly, behavioral traits hit some kind of an exponential takeoff around 40,000 to 100,000 years ago, and language must have also had an exponential takeoff. Because, for example, presumably 6 million years ago, we started with about the same number of concepts that chimpanzees have, which is about 30 concepts. So we had 30 concepts 6 million years ago, and now we have 1 million English words. So if you tried to put that onto the same plot with a linear axis here, it doesn't make any sense to do this. These early humans would have 200,000 words in their vocabulary, and yet they're only making simple stone tools. So it doesn't make any sense to do that. And continuing, we'll look at some of the other traits about modern humans. The average modern human has about a 10,000 word working vocabulary. And you can add more to that, but you have 10,000 words that you really know and you can use. In addition, only about 2,000 words cover about 80% of modern language usage. So somewhere in that 2,000 to 10,000 range is kind of an indication of modern human language usage. Keep that number in mind. As a model for this vocabulary expansion with time, let's start with a model that starts with 30 words at 6 million years ago, and it ends with something less than 1 million words at 5,000 years ago. And a logarithmic word count scale could be achieved for this model if we increase the size of the vocabulary by a factor of 1.5 at each of the new behavioral traits. So going back to the original plot that we have, the idea is at each of these behavioral traits here, you increase the vocabulary by a factor of 1.5. What that does is that converts this linear scale here into a logarithmic scale. And the numbers that I quoted you before give you this kind of a logarithmic scale. So on this scale here, we started at 30 words at 6 million years ago. We ended at about 250,000 words at 5,000 years ago, and that's on line with going to the modern language vocabulary size. And behavioral modernity occurred right here. Now, during that time of the behavioral modernity, 40 to 100,000 years ago, the vocabulary grew from about 4,000 words to 15,000 words, according to this model. So that puts those humans right in the average modern human vocabulary range. So these were probably close to average modern humans. They just didn't have all the technology that we've built up. Now, this is obviously just a model, but I think it suggests that we approach modern humanity around the time of behavioral modernity in terms of our language ability. Now, another question I have is, how did who we are change when our consciousness changed? Now, ancient humans would have identified totally with the body. I am this body. That's what an animal must think, if he's thinking. Whereas modern humans identify with their autobiographical self or their narrative self. And that includes things like my name, my narrative history, my desires and goals, my accomplishments, my future plans, my friends and family, etc. I'll call this the I, me, my concept. That's an abstract concept, and I combine the words I, me, my because any one of those pronouns refer to this concept. So this is a very complex concept in modern human. Now, the conceptual world gave us the modern technology that we experience in society, and it was obviously very useful. However, it also caused a living problem, especially this I, me, my concept. That causes a big problem. And spirituality is the cure for that problem. Now, I'll be talking about these 2 points in the third part of this talk. So I first have to talk about agents.